Sam Elliott built his legacy on characters who didn't need to raise their voices to command a room. Men of few words, yet heavy with presence. The kind whose silence could say more than dialogue ever could. But behind one of his most iconic roles in Tombstone, there was a truth audiences never saw, a truth born not from the gunfights or glory, but from the chaos behind the camera, a storm that tested his loyalty, his patience, and his belief in what makes a story worth telling. When the cameras began rolling in the spring of 1993, Elliott felt something rare in the industry, genuine pride. At 50, after decades of weathered supporting roles, he finally had a chance to embody a man who wasn't defined by swagger but by duty, Virgil Earp, the steadfast older brother who held the line when others faltered. Kevin Jare's script had struck him deeply. It wasn't just another Western soaked in blood and bravado. It was a story that sought to understand the men behind the guns, their moral weight, their fears, their dignity. Every page carried humanity, not just heroics. For Elliott, who had always valued truth above a spectacle, Tombstone felt like destiny. But destiny, as he would soon learn, can be fragile. From the earliest days on set in the Arizona desert, cracks began to show. Kevin Jare, the talented writer behind Glory, had never directed before. His vision was poetic, but untested. And on the third day of shooting, Elliott sensed trouble. The scenes dragged, not because of the actors, but because of Jare's insistence on sweeping cinematic shots, the kind John Ford might have used 50 years earlier. They were beautiful, but lifeless. The tension, the grit, the intimacy that Tombstone needed were slowly draining away. Cinematographer William Fraker, a respected veteran, tried to guide Jare toward tighter, more emotional frames, but Jare resisted, clinging to the purity of his vision, even as the schedule began to unravel. Elliott, ever the quiet observer, didn't speak up. That wasn't his way, but he felt the unease settling in his bones, a foreboding sense that this film he believed in so deeply was already slipping off course. By the end of the first month, the project was behind the schedule, the budget groaned, and the Christmas release Disney had promised hung over the cast like a storm cloud. Then came the inevitable. Kevin Jare was fired. For Elliott, it felt like watching the captain thrown overboard mid-voyage. He admired Jare's passion, his words, his sincerity. To see him dismissed so abruptly felt like betrayal, but a necessary one. The studio brought in George P. Cosmatos, a man known not for poetry, but for discipline. What Elliott didn't know yet was that the heart of Tombstone, the very story he had fallen in love with, was about to be rewritten in silence and secrecy. When George P. Cosmatos stepped onto the set, Tombstone began to change. Officially, he was the new director, but in truth, the reins of control were quietly being taken by someone else, someone who refused to let the film die. That man was Kurt Russell. Elliott would later reveal that Russell, though uncredited, became the invisible hand guiding nearly every scene. Each night after filming, when the desert went silent and exhaustion hung thick in the air, Russell would meet with members of the crew. He would write out shot lists, restructure pages, and plan the next day's work with a calm urgency that kept the project alive. Val Kilmer, who played the unforgettable Doc Holliday and was living in Russell's guest house at the time, later recalled how those nights often stretched until dawn. They weren't just rewriting a film, they were rescuing it. For Sam Elliott, it was both a comfort and a heartbreak. Comfort, because someone had stepped up. Heartbreak because the story that Kevin Gara had so tenderly crafted was being stripped down page by page. Close to 30 pages vanished. Scenes that explored the Earp brothers' family bond, their fears, and their fragile humanity. These weren't filler lines, they were the soul of the story. Elliott once admitted that if he had known how much would be cut, he might never have taken the role. Virgil's moral weight, his struggle to balance justice and compassion, was fading into the background. What remained was still powerful, but shallower, less human. One evening during production, Elliott sat quietly in a bar, sipping a beer after another long day on set. A crew member joked, "You should have played Wyatt." Elliott paused, smiled faintly, and simply said, "Tell me about it." Behind that short, dry line was a deep disappointment, one he rarely let show. But quitting was never an option for him. He had given his word, and loyalty was a part of his DNA. Instead, he chose a quiet rebellion. Elliott began sneaking fragments of the lost material back into his performance. A line here, a look there, a pause that hinted at what had been erased. They were as small acts of defiance, invisible to most, but they carried immense meaning. In those subtle gestures, he preserved Virgil Earp's dignity. He gave life to what the cuts had taken away. Just like Virgil himself, steadfast, disciplined, and unwilling to abandon duty, Elliott stayed the course, holding his ground even as the world around him shifted. He wasn't just playing the role. He was the role. The deeper the production sank into turmoil, the more Tombstone began to resemble the very kind of frontier it portrayed. Beautiful on the surface, but lawless underneath. The transition from Kevin Gara to George P. Cosmatos was anything but smooth. Cosmatos was known for control and precision, traits that could keep a film alive but also choke the spirit out of it. His methods clashed almost immediately with the creative core that had brought Tombstone to life. Cinematographer William Fraker, a seasoned craftsman with decades in the business, found himself at odds with Cosmatos from the start. Fraker wanted artistry, subtlety, frames that breathed with emotion. Cosmatos demanded efficiency and obedience. Their tension boiled until one afternoon, in a moment of reckless frustration, they rammed their golf carts straight into each other. The set froze. The silence afterward said everything. By the time the dust settled, 17 crew members had walked off the project. The weight of exhaustion hung heavy in the air, and every remaining soul felt it, especially Sam Elliott. He wasn't a man who raised his voice, nor did he feed on drama, but behind his calm exterior, he carried a quiet ache. He had signed on to Tombstone because he believed in its heart, a story of brotherhood, loyalty, and moral strength. Now, that vision seemed to be crumbling into chaos. He once described the experience as brilliant and painful all at once. Brilliant because the cast, Russell, Kilmer, and the rest, poured everything they had into their performances. Painful because behind the lens, the spirit of the film seemed to be falling apart piece by piece. Disney, anxious about the looming Christmas release, began applying pressure. Schedules tightened. Nights grew longer. Days stretched endlessly under the scorching Arizona sun. The fatigue was visible, not just on faces, but in the performances themselves. The magic they were trying to capture was being born out of pure endurance. Only about 15 of Kevin Gara's original filmed scenes would make it into the final cut. The rest lost to time, to stress, to the studio's demand for a cleaner, faster story. And yet, somehow, amid the anger and exhaustion, a fragile unity formed. Kurt Russell's late-night planning sessions became a lifeline. Val Kilmer, despite his own battles, stood firmly by him. The cast leaned on one another, a band of weary survivors trying to keep something sacred from slipping away. For Elliott, it became personal. He wasn't fighting for fame or even for Virgil Earp's screen time anymore. He was fighting for truth, the soul of the story he had first believed in. And through all the chaos, he never missed a call time, never complained, never broke the silent promise he made to himself when he first put on Virgil's badge, to see it through, no matter the cost. While the cast and crew of Tombstone were locked in their uphill battle, another storm was brewing, not on their set, but just a few hundred miles away. In New Mexico, Kevin Costner was quietly building his own empire. His film, simply titled Wyatt Earp, had the full backing of Warner Brothers, a budget nearly twice the size of Tombstone, and a director with prestige. Lawrence Kasdan, the man behind The Big Chill and Silverado. Compared to the distant deadlines in Arizona, Costner's production looked like a dream. Calm, organized, luxurious. For Kurt Russell, already carrying the hidden weight of ghost directing Tombstone, it was a punch to the gut. He worried constantly that their smaller or scrappier film would be crushed before it even reached theaters. After all, how could their $25 million movie compete with a 3-hour Hollywood epic led by one of the biggest stars in the world? Sam Elliott remembered one particular night vividly. They were staying at a modest Holiday Inn after another grueling day of shooting. Russell sat on the edge of his bed, shoulders slumped, eyes lost in thought. His mind was somewhere else, across state lines perhaps, in New Mexico, imagining the rival set, with its polished equipment and the steady funding. Elliott asked him plainly, "What's eating you, Kurt?" Russell sighed, listing the worries that had been gnawing at him. The rival budget, the marketing machine, the power of Costner's name. He wondered aloud if their work, messy, chaotic, born of blood and sweat, would even stand a chance. Elliott listened, then cut him off with a single quiet truth. They don't have this script, and they don't have this damn cast. The room went still. Russell looked up, and in that moment, the weight lifted, just a little. Elliott's faith was unshakable. He had seen the raw electricity on their set, the camaraderie between the actors, the fire that no studio budget could buy. He believed that Tombstone had something real, the grit of imperfect men fighting for something worth keeping alive. And history, as it turned out, proved him right. When Tombstone finally hit theaters on December 24th, 1993, it exploded far beyond expectations, earning $56 million at the box office, more than double its modest budget. When Wyatt Earp arrived 6 months later, weighed down by grandeur and length, it struggled to connect. Critics called it slow, bloated, even joyless. Meanwhile, Tombstone became a cult legend, quoted endlessly, rewatched for decades, and remembered not for its chaos, but for its heart. Through it all, Sam Elliott never gloated. He simply nodded, knowing that truth, like duty, doesn't need to shout to endure. For most audiences, Tombstone lives forever in the fierce stare of Kurt Russell's Wyatt Earp and the razor-sharp wit of Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday. Their lines became legend, whispered and shouted in bars, movie nights, and fan conventions alike. But standing just behind them, steady, silent, and almost unseen, was Sam Elliott's Virgil Earp, the older brother who carried the burden no one else could. Elliott later confessed that nearly 30 pages of Kevin Jarre's original script, scenes that would have given Virgil his full emotional depth, were cut in the rewriting chaos. Those lost pages told of Virgil's inner struggle, his love for his family, his moral doubts, his private grief. Without them, Virgil became more of a supporting shadow than the beating heart Jarre had envisioned. Elliott admitted in an interview years later that had he known the extent of those cuts, he might have turned the role down altogether. But even stripped of dialogue, he refused to let the character fade. Instead, he began to act through a silence. He used pauses, glances, and subtle gestures to restore what words could no longer express. A faint tightening of the jaw, a distant look before drawing his gun, these became his dialogue, and in doing so, Elliott transformed Virgil from a forgotten brother into something far greater, the conscience of the film. One of the most overlooked moments in Tombstone comes just before the chaos of the OK Corral. Amid the rising tension, Virgil quietly rescues a child caught in the street. It lasts only seconds, barely noticed by most viewers, but that act defines him more than any gunfight ever could. He wasn't driven by rage or revenge, but by duty. That single moment carries the entire weight of Sam Elliott's performance. It is the moment that reveals who Virgil truly is, a man bound by justice, not ego, by honor, not glory. Film scholars looking back often call Elliott's Virgil the moral anchor of Tombstone. His voice, steady, resonant, and aged by wisdom, became the heartbeat of decency in a world of chaos. Elliott himself later reflected that his journey on Tombstone mirrored Virgil's almost exactly. He too had stayed loyal when others faltered. He too carried responsibility when things fell apart. And just like Virgil, he never asked for recognition, only for the story to endure. His performance, subtle yet unshakable, became less about lines and more about presence. In that restraint, in that quiet gravity, he gave Virgil Earp a soul that would outlast the noise of the gunfire. When Tombstone finally rode into theaters on December 24th, 1993, the exhaustion of its making was still etched on every frame. 88 brutal days of shooting, sleepless nights, and fractured tempers had left their mark. Yet when the lights dimmed and the audience watched that first gunfight explode on screen, none of that chaos mattered anymore. The film struck a nerve. Audiences embraced it, critics admired its grit, and fans made it immortal. "I'm your Huckleberry" became one of the most quoted lines in movie history. Val Kilmer's charm, Kurt Russell's intensity, and Sam Elliott's quiet gravity all merged into something rare, a Western that felt both mythic and deeply human. The box office numbers spoke volumes. $56 million in North America, more than doubling its budget. 6 months later, Wyatt Earp, the grand, expensive rival that had haunted their production, hit theaters. Despite its elegance and star power, it stumbled. The verdict was swift and poetic. Tombstone endured. Wyatt Earp faded. Sam Elliott was proud, but his pride came with a shadow. He would later admit that he was haunted by what had been lost, the missing 30 pages that once gave Virgil a fuller life. He often spoke wistfully about scenes the audience never saw, family dinners filled with quiet laughter, moments of brotherly warmth before the bloodshed, glimpses of the heart that Kevin Jarre had written so beautifully. Those pages, Elliott said, were the soul of Tombstone. Without them, a piece of the story would always remain unfinished. Yet, in a strange way, that loss mirrored Virgil Earp himself. Virgil was the brother who carried responsibility without glory, who bore the scars so others could survive. Elliott realized years later that he had lived that same role behind the scenes, standing steady while the chaos raged, keeping faith when others doubted, holding the film together not through fame, but through quiet conviction. In retrospectives today, critics often call Sam Elliott the moral compass of Tombstone. His performance didn't shout for attention. It anchored the storm. He was the steady heartbeat beneath the film's fury, the reminder that even in violence there can be honor. For Elliott, Tombstone remains both a triumph and a wound, a masterpiece born from a struggle. He gave everything to a film that took so much from him, and in the end, his silence became his legacy. He once said, with that unmistakable voice that sounds carved from gravel and memory, "You give what you can. You protect what matters. The rest, you just let go." Behind the gunfire, the grit, and the glory, Tombstone was a story about endurance, about men holding the line when everything around them broke. And Sam Elliott, in life as in film, held that line until the very end. Do you think Tombstone would have been even greater if those missing scenes had survived? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories behind the movies you thought you knew.